Yeah, new theory-wise video is good. All right, might have to check it out today.
Ever wonder how we went from this to this?
Ooh, that awakened Leviathan.
Sure, it's all ones and zeros, but it's rare that one game, over the course of its lifespan, changes so much about its moment-to-moment gameplay. Well, it would be rare if MMOs didn't exist. The kind
Did you guys ever think that when you were playing RuneScape 25 years ago, when you were 12 in the middle school technology lab, that the combat would evolve to what it is now, and then you'd still be playing the game 25 years later because there were no better MMOs that have come out? I didn't. It's kind of crazy that we're still here. I thought we'd be in flying cars by now, and 25 years later, we got all the technology in the world, and no one can make a better MMO than RuneScape or WoW. That is crazy to me.
of evolutions in combat, in gameplay, and systems that would be reserved to sequels, prequels, and spiritual successors are all packaged neatly into a single game. Not neatly, actually, it's usually incredibly messy and it sometimes kills the game, but it's all there thanks to the genre demanding progress, iteration without pivoting into an entirely different game. RuneScape is no stranger to this. Its oldest incarnation was an MUD, then became what is now referred to as RuneScape Classic, and then went through its first evolutionary period with RuneScape 2 in 2004. And then RuneScape 3, and then back to RuneScape 2, but also still RuneScape 3. It's complicated. Over the course of this 25-year journey, the gameplay has changed quite drastically. The core remains the 600 millisecond tick system governing each batched player action, as well as the invisible tiles which house the world itself. What we do in that world, though, has, in a roundabout sense, evolved. Our attitudes, our motivations, the simple joy of simply chopping a simple tree and simply burning some simple logs simply. Simple is RuneScape. It's old school, one-to-one actions, clicking and waiting. That's what it is on the surface anyway. That's how it's sold. That's a design principle, but it's not an on-the-ground reality. Old school RuneScape is incredibly complex, deep, often...
I think RuneScape is the definition of like how simplicity can be complex. It's how complex can we make simple is the basis of like RuneScape, right? So you can keep it simple sometimes, but then sometimes you want that complexity, which makes the combat harder. So what Zaryu told me one time was he's like, the only reason RuneScape is hard is because they don't let you keybind your stuff. And I thought about that and I was like, yeah, that is kind of true. By limiting all of your actions to one hand, you now are not able to like the only thing you can do with your left hand is keybinds, like where you're swapping between your books, which does give you faster clicks, right? But because they don't let you keybind like protect from melee, where you could just click it with like a 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 on your left hand, it makes the game more complex. So they add complexity by limiting stuff, by taking stuff away. And I actually see that same trend in a lot of content creators. They challenge themselves by taking away content, right? So this is how the evolution of hardcore started. What happens if we take away the ability to die, right? And then what happens if you get somebody like Settled who locks themselves into a zone? Or what happens if he locks himself to only being able to go to islands and he tries to see how far he can get in the game? And so by taking away stuff, you can make the game harder and you can make the game more interesting. And that's a whole nother thing that's just really cool that I've been kind of looking at and noticing in MMOs and patterns. And it happens in WoW too. So
unintuitive and frustrating. It has a steeper learning curve than every popular MMO, and that's just the learning curve. As players, our access to external data, wikis, guides, and of course plugins have raised the skill floor of the game drastically. And today, I want to discuss how, why, and what that has led to. But before I do, consider snuggling up for a quick nap. What's that? You can't. You are one of the 3 adults in the world today that suffer from symptoms of insomnia. You constantly wake up tired and groggy. Don't worry,
Is that
the
you guys?
sponsor of today's video, Mantis Sleep, has you covered. They sent me one of their new gen sleep masks a little while ago, and while I was never much of a sleep mask enjoyer, what they've done here has kind of changed my mind. I get it now.
Okay.
Their products are comfortable, soft, adjustable, and best of all, help you manage some of the most important moments in your life. Sleep. Bad sleep impacts you in more ways than you think.
Yeah, sleep
from
is
worse
important.
attention spans to even some health risks. Using this mask has helped me take control of my sleep schedule and become far more productive when I'm awake. If you're interested in checking them out,
It looks
feel free
pretty
to use my
sick.
promo code TheoryWise and get 10% off your first purchase. Link in the description.
I use
Now
this
back
whenever
to
you
the
go
video.
live.
One of
What
the
the
most
heck, Jordy?
interesting facts about RuneScape's mechanical evolution over multiple decades is that it's as much influenced by player discovery as it is medium-driven iteration. What I mean by this is most games change based on their players' general skill levels and expectations derived from other competing games. RuneScape changed in response to players figuring out the unintentional intricacies of its combat, movement, and more. So for a game like World of Warcraft, the many ways its gameplay has evolved since release is easy to track. Early raid bosses were a collection of simple mechanics, usually between 2 or 3, that punished you heavily for failing. Fire is over here, don't stand in it. A debuff is applied to a player, dispel it, or they will die. At the time, this alone was innovative and surprisingly intuitive. It wasn't commonplace to see an MMO create large group content, 40 players in an arena, and force them to coordinate, not just in what they're targeting, but how they're targeting what they're doing together. Difficulty in this case is group size dependent, and while I don't want to spend too much time discussing difficulty in this video, as I'm working on one explicitly about the topic, I will put it simply: the larger a group, the simpler the mechanics ought be. So as raid sizes in World of Warcraft shrunk from 40-man to 25-man and eventually to 10 and 20-man, mechanics proportionally became more complex. Simultaneously, players became better at playing. They mastered their character kits, the specific tells for boss mechanics, and developed easy-to-understand terminology to communicate. All of this created an environment where the skill floor raised drastically to accommodate those players. Today, even the easiest raid encounters in World of Warcraft are far more complex than those that existed in 2004, even if those easier difficulties aren't as punishing. We're all better at games now,
Okay,
and the
I see
language
that.
of not standing in fire or grouping up to soak and split damage of a certain
Drop
kind
the
of spell
circles on the
has
edge.
become ubiquitous. Most games have these mechanics now, and the MMO's learning curve shrunk in part due to this.
I've never seen this fight before in my life, but like they're dropping the small circles on the edge of the room, and then they're dropping the big circles on the edge of the room. That seems pretty simple here.
RuneScape
And then
also
there's
became more
Then there's when they see this swirly stack, they're all stacking up in it. So there's 3 different types of circles. That's the mechanic.
difficult, but the developer-player arms race took on a different guise. Much like how RuneScape's skill floor and ceiling are drastically different to other MMOs, the ways in which the combat evolved over time is too. What hasn't evolved is the subscription button and the like button, so go ahead and click them if you want. Anyway, as with other
Got 'em.
MMOs in the late 90s and early 2000s, the most difficult
I hit the like button.
encounters in RuneScape were binary stat checks solved by gear and grouping. Alone, you are leaving it up to RNG to determine outcome, but together, apes strong. We are able to mitigate chance and pummel the boss. Bossing in general was seen as a group-driven activity. The term implied a level of communality, of synergy. Solo encounters were less common, whereas today they are the norm. At this point, we're still in 2004. In September, the Calphite Queen was released, and much like every other boss beforehand, was created with the intent of being an endgame group fight. A multi-stage encounter wherein you're incentivized to bring different combat styles to mitigate its
That's what
overhead
Calphite
protection
Queen looks
prayers,
like?
or have teammates that took on specific roles, a major, ranger, and meleeer. Quickly, Jagex found a flaw. Well, the players did,
What
and then
the
Jagex
heck?
responded to it. You could use the game's overhead prayer mechanic to mitigate most of the damage, making her effectively soloable. While preceding encounters like the King Black Dragon would hit through prayer thanks to the way his breath attacks work, the Calphite Queen didn't. Jagex saw this and saw how players discovered ways to avoid taking damage and updated the Queen to attack with all 3 combat styles at random. Also, she never missed anymore with her ranged and mage attacks, meaning that whoever is tanking her would get totally obliterated if other players don't pick up the slack and attack in their stead. That's because eating hard food in old school RuneScape, which was the only type of food that existed at the time, put a delay on your next attack, meaning that the more you ate, the less damage you were capable of dealing. The Calphite Queen successfully became a group encounter, low complexity, a single mechanic, and high incentives to bring your friends.
A group encounter.
This also set the stage for a rather interesting relationship between the developers and the players. Using the pre-established game mechanics, users were able to find an unintended solution to the boss, a way of avoiding its damage. Take note of this because player ingenuity becomes the backbone for most of the game's combat.
Isn't it funny that developers, they will make something and they're like, okay, this is gonna be a cool way to like bring people together to try and like, group up, and maybe they'll have to team up and beat this boss together. They'll make some friendships. And the first thing people do is try to figure out a way to do it alone. That's what people do. Can I do this boss without any help? That's what people are over here trying to do. And then they figure out a way to do that instead. And then the devs are like, well, it's too late. Just leave it in there.
Iteration. Shortly after, in 2005, the Barrows were released, notably a solo boss. And in that same year, the Fight Caves, a solo challenge, was released as well. Each one leaned heavier into prayer as the core of RuneScape's combat system.
Yeah, prayer is like everything now.
As I don't have access to the developers who worked on the game back then.
Those god dang prayer pots, man. They're always eluding me.
I will go out on a limb and say that they used the player discovery during the first weeks of the Calphite Queen release as a lesson, because both of these new fights were specifically oriented around toying with the prayer mechanic. Barrows sought to challenge players with prayer upkeep as the crypts they explored slowly drained prayer points. The incentive was to go fast and to use prayer potions. Meanwhile, the Fight Caves innovated with internal prayer mechanics as well as external ones. Much like Barrows, upkeep was a foundation. Because you had to fight through dozens of progressively more difficult waves, all on a single inventory, you had to itemize for longevity, endurance, which is what made the final wave so challenging after spending well over a...
Bruh, I just thought of this. WoW, in WoW, your mana bar would be like prayer if mana pots were the only way to restore it. And everybody used mana. It's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it.
An hour in the arena, you face the Tustok Jad. For the first time, internal reaction times were introduced to RuneScape. Based on the kind of attack animation he did, the player responded with an appropriate overhead prayer to fully mitigate damage. You see how the developer's oversight in damage mitigation on the Calphite Queen translated.
In WoW, your mana right now, or your mana just restores on its own. It restores very slowly while you're in combat, and then it restores faster when you're not in combat, and then you can eat or drink over the course of 30 seconds to restore your mana. And so the concept of like using some type of energy or some type of resource bar and then restoring that resource bar is like a very core fundamental of MMOs. It just manifests in different forms. But it's interesting that RuneScape's prayer bar does not restore on its own. Like you have to have something, you have to consume something or touch something to restore that prayer. And those things that you touch are in specific spots. But in WoW, it will just restore normally over time at a slow rate.
To an actual mechanic. Now you can fully mitigate all the damage, you just had to pray correctly, respond and react to the animation. It's silly and simple today, but at the time, for a browser-based MMO defined by pointing and clicking, this changed everything. Now, preparation became just one step, how you oriented your inventory, which gear you chose to bring. The second step, execution, altered the paradigm of RuneScape's combat forever.
Right.
Back then, evolution came yearly. First, the Dagonoth Kings put the focus back on group encounters with individual roles, and 2 years later, the God Wars dungeon was released. Once again, the mechanics operated internally. You're not so much reacting to the boss, but rather preparing for one. As RuneScape grew older, the skill of the average player increased, as it does with every long-running game or franchise, and frankly, RuneScape was slow to accommodate this.
People used to do bandos in a mass. That is not meta anymore. Now you just solo it with door alter method.
You can't just look over at your competition, World of Warcraft in this case,
King,
and transpose those mechanics onto RuneScape. It's not a one-to-one translation. There was an interesting innovation that came in 2007 though, one I have mentioned in a prior video. The giant rock boss in My Arm's Big Adventure, which is a quest, was the first ever instance of an area damage ability. The bird would launch a flying rock at the player, and with good timing, they would move away.
Oh, I remember this bird.
This was one of the first adaptations of a standard RPG mechanic.
I one-shot this bird, of course.
The tone for just about every future innovation in RuneScape's standard design space. We cannot undersell just how important this moment was. Area effect abilities are the simplest way to convey mechanical danger, and future bosses use this newly established language to convey just that. In 2011, Nex was released as an addition to the God Wars dungeon and integrated all the lessons of the past half-decade, switching prayers, damaging ground abilities, and copious preparations mixed with the odd sprinkle of sustain. I find it fascinating how RuneScape began to inhabit standard RPG mechanics, dodging AoEs, stacking, spreading, alongside its bespoke RuneScape-y ones, prayer, gear switching, and eventually an integration with player-driven discovery, the tick system. Now obviously players didn't discover ticks. The 600 millisecond system that forms the backbone of the entire game was an intentional design choice bred from the limitations of its era, but much like so many of the coolest emergent player discoveries in any game, learning to manipulate those limitations created some of the deepest and most innovative solutions to things that would otherwise be seen as flaws. If you're a RuneScape player who fancies themselves a big brain PvM boss enjoyer, then you are likely aware that just about every single fight in the entire game has a level of emergent discovery attached to its meta execution. More importantly, each fight is bound by RuneScape's tile-based movement and batched 600 millisecond ticks.
Right.
Meaning that when you start to parse the game as those two governing principles, you start to unwind the visuals and sound from the true bones holding those things together. You see, a developer's job is to hide those limitations. In fact, the quote-unquote evolved version of RuneScape, RuneScape 3, very much tried to do that. If the game was seen as being bound by tiny little squares on a grid, then that makes it sound childish, outdated, stupid. If it was just pointing and clicking, then that's—
I'm not gonna lie, man. The RuneScape players don't really seem to care about the whole simplicity of the tile movement and all that. I mean, I think it is a bit, it is a bit, it's not very appealing for new players, but once you play RuneScape, you don't care anymore. Which is something totally different in itself. But I guess they tried to hide that with RS3, and it doesn't seem like it's working very well because not a lot of people want to play RS3.
It's hard to make exciting for a newer generation of players. So this version of RuneScape did its best to hide those things, not by editing them out of the game's infrastructure, but rather by deprioritizing them in outward design. Simple things like the area you're clicking on is highlighted as a circle, not a square,
blink?
or certain abilities cast because, yes, this version of the game has abilities akin to a standard hotbar RPG, take up circles on the ground rather than squares. That may sound
tiles and ticks and everything. I didn't like it at first, and it definitely grew on me, but it just wasn't very appealing coming from a WoW player. Like, In WoW, you can move like a fraction of a millimeter to the left and right. Like there's no limit. It's no like you have to be here, 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 or here. Like there's so much like in between movement, and you have a hitbox. You know, you don't really have a hitbox in RuneScape. It's what tile are you standing on? That's where the damage is. Where you were either on that tile or you weren't, and it's not where your character looks like he is. It's where your true tile is. So even if your character is on that tile visually, he might not be on that in actuality, and that took me a while to grasp that concept, because in WoW, where your character looks like he is actually where he is. And that was a totally new thing for me, I guess, in RuneScape. That took me a while.
Totally innocuous. Why would anyone complain about that? Who cares? Yet when you think about it, doesn't this make no sense? Take Sunshine as an example.
And thank you for the prime.
Ground targeted ability that grants you a damage increase while you stand in it. Notoriously, its effect is larger than its visuals, because the ground that it's actually on is larger than the circle that it inhabits. By trying to hide
Wait, you're right there, Tech, because once you do grasp that concept, you start to think and move and click in 6-second intervals. You start to look at where your true tile is instead of your character, and you start to evolve as a gamer in this game, and it happens pretty rapidly. I would say the fight that evolved me the most as a player for timing and movement was probably Doom, and then second would be Inferno with prayer flicking, and then using the wall to come out and then learn how to destack and things like that. CG was the first. I would say CG is probably the third one. It teaches you like the basics of combat very well, using two different forms of combat and then flicking two different forms of damage. But with Infernal Cape and then at Doom, it takes it up another notch. And so those are like the three different points for me in the game, where I feel like after doing those three fights, I was just different after that. I was just like, I was not the same. I wasn't on the same level that I used to be. I'd very clearly advanced my skills after doing those three fights enough times.
The infrastructure of the game, the developers unintentionally sacrificed visual clarity. Not to make this a RuneScape 3 video, but it was only recently did these priorities
not Dragon Slayer 1. Guys, nothing in the early game of RuneScape made me better at the game. I'm sorry. It made me maybe worse, because I just learned how to safe spot everything. That's if like the first month, you don't learn anything. You don't learn RuneScape. You don't get better at the game. Like, you don't get better at the game until CG. Like, just nothing in the game really advances you at the level that the game is at now. Like, you need to really get to the Grand Master Quest before you start to see any difficulty. I mean, maybe some of the Master Quests, like Sins of the Father. But even those are brain dead compared to the stuff that happens later in the game. So, yeah, that's why it's tough. It's tough to say that I really advanced at all in combat. And that's one of the things about RuneScape, is I wish some of those advanced PVM stuff were in the game earlier. And I hope that Cow Boss gets to be that thing. Gets to fill that void of like, okay, this is how hard the combat actually gets. And you can see that right from level 3.
Begin to once again shift. In one of the most recent updates, the Sanctum of Rebirth dungeon, the developers created a new telegraph system that showcased what was invented for the game all the way back in 2007 with the giant rock, area effect damage. But unlike the click highlight and this sunshine ability, they're squares. See? Clarity, and it looks good too. This change gave them the ability to create more precise mechanics with tighter timings. It should go as no surprise that by embracing the backbone, the architecture of the game, they made some of the most beloved boss encounters ever released. If you're wondering why I brought this all up, I want you to consider this. Instead of shying away from the fundamentals, what if Jagex embraced them from the get-go? That's what old school RuneScape began to do shortly after their first new encounter, Zulrah. The rigid grid of RuneScape was not only something understood by its developers, but also the players. Back in the early days of RuneScape, I'm sure there was the keen-eyed few who understood the functions of the game's architecture, processed the ticks,
Thank you very much for the 4
saw
months.
the hidden tiles. Yet with old school RuneScape's return in 2013, this became a language spoken by the player base, a language that only became more popular in time. Much like how between 2004 and 2007, World of Warcraft standardized callouts for traditional MMORPG mechanics, Jagex 2 created a lexicon for their version of an MMO. RuneScape was so unique, so disconnected from those games, it needed an entirely separate method of communicating those ideas. And the more players began to talk about ticks, understand the movement system, manipulate it to their benefit, Jagex was faced with a choice: try to hide it like in RuneScape 3, or embrace it. Considering old school RuneScape's inception was as a harsh juxtaposition to RuneScape 3, effectively becoming the antithesis to that game's least popular traits, of course, the at the time development team chose to embrace it. You like squares? Fine, have an entire boss room full of squares. This just allows us to make it harder. An example of this player-led shift in philosophy is with the integration of what is commonly referred to as a tile skip. As I mentioned, RuneScape is one giant grid of tiles, and your player moves through those tiles, one for every 600 milliseconds.
This took me a long time to figure out.
Running, however, speeds up this action by 2 times. You are now moving across.
Because I didn't have True Tile for the first month playing the game, I didn't realize that your character doesn't touch the tile next to you when you're running. I did not understand this concept for a very long time until I got True Tile.
2 tiles every tick. But here's where that gets a little silly.
You're just teleporting 2 tiles at a time.
Of the engine, or perhaps just a shortcut while coding the game, one of the original developers, likely one of the Gowers, made your character's actions batched. Your player character takes up only 1 tile at any given time, at any given 600 millisecond increment. What this means is that there's no real way to speed up the action of movement. You can only be in one area. So the workaround was that when you run in old school RuneScape, you're actually just skipping tiles, every odd tile in fact, which in turn allows you to do some really goofy stuff, like completely avoid this wall beast trap in the Lumbridge Caves. It only triggers if you're on this 1 tile, so by activating Run, standing 1 tile beside the trigger point, and simply clicking ahead, your character skips over that tile. Is this unintuitive? Yes. Do you need an external plugin to help explain this to you? Yes. Did this create some of the strangest yet most satisfying mechanics I've ever done in an MMO? Also, yes. I don't want to get into every example of this because, again, I am working on a video about difficulty in RuneScape where we will get very deep into this nerdy shit. I want you to understand that when the players began to harness these mechanics to their advantage, Jagex didn't really have an option other than working with them. It's not like the old school version of the game should recode the entire movement system, right? That's why in the very first raid released in 2017, you can do this. By tracking the true tile of this janky looking electricity, I can skip it by timing my own movement in accordance. Since that discovery, the tile skip has become one of the many emergent mechanics popularized in the community, to the point where its unintentional inclusion in the first raid became an intentional one later on. It's not all perfect though, or intuitive. Notice how a lack of
Guys, tile skipping is the equivalent of mage blinking in WoW, because you're literally blinking from one area to another and you don't register the tiles or the area that you go across, so you're teleporting. So when you're just, it's OP in RuneScape that you could teleport just by moving. And that's pretty crazy that you can do that, because Blink is one of the most OP abilities in raids in WoW.
Intuitiveness is a huge point of friction in old school RuneScape. Because the game is old and running on an antiquated backend, a ton of its mechanics are emergent and therefore difficult to really explain in the game without having some really weird pop-up breaking down the architecture of its bizarre code. Zarpus in the Theater of Blood, the second raid for example, has one tile wide poison puddles that notably can't be skipped. If you move over them like you would the Wall Beast trigger, you still take some poison damage. Personally, I think Jagex understood that this was a poor idea as it causes players to second guess every use of this now well-established mechanic, and so in almost every future boss, it's actually integrated. Yama has these shadow explosions bifurcate out of the corner of the arena, which very well can be tile skipped. In fact, it's very common to do so. The same applies to Heikotl's shockwaves. This was even integrated into skilling activities such as the Hollowed Sepulchre, featuring plenty of unique mechanics that incentivize a deeper understanding of movement. These floor tiles, the yellow ones send you backward.
Did bro just say Hui? He's talking about Huey?
The blue ones teleport you forward, are patterned in such a way as to allow skilled players to manipulate movement to their benefit. To think all of this started with a rock throwing a rock at a player in a silly quest about a troll that wants to learn to farm. We went from being stat checked by the Calphite Queen to being purely skill checked in some of the most recent bosses. As I pointed out in my video on RuneScape's itemization identity crisis, this eventual reliance on skill checks over stat checks has developed an environment where pure mechanical skill sits above all else in new content. On the surface, this sounds great, right? Incentivize getting good over RNG hits from the Calphite Queen. Yes, by and large, it is good. It has created for some of the best fights in the game, and I think most players will agree that old school RuneScape's bossing today is the best it has ever been. But it has its own issues. RuneScape is an incredibly interconnected game. There are so many different things that feed into one another. When you're creating a fight, you can't just think of what is the most fun, you need to consider a lot more too, such as the economy surrounding the items the fight drops. Zulrah had notoriously overtuned common drops that created large economic issues after it became an easily farmable encounter. Meanwhile, other fights such as the Nightmare have such poor common drops and such rare uniques that they're often not seen as worth doing at all. As a developer, you need to balance the tedious grind with the excitement of the loot and the impact of all of this in the economy. One way would be by creating restrictions, gating the boss through a variety of different means. Maybe you need to do a Grandmaster quest that requires hundreds of hours of grinding to begin. Maybe you need a certain key item to access it. Maybe you just aren't geared or statted enough to do it consistently. All of these things are individual tuning knobs that form the balance of resource input, how much you're spending to do the fight, with resource output, what you're getting out of it. Vorkath, for example, is, well, terrible, but also not done for his hilariously rare and borderline useless uniques. It prints supplies, and as a result, is a rather consistent source of income for non-Ironmen. With that in mind, it's also a pretty stat-checky boss too. Much like all the way back with the Calphite Queen, you cannot pray against all of Vorkath's attacks. Most players chug an anti-fire potion, camp pray mage, and then hope he doesn't continuously barrage them with ranged attacks. Eventually though, due to this effectively unavoidable damage, your inventory dries up. You cannot continue mowing through kills and must go to your bank and prepare for another trip. This breaks up the pacing, creates a definitive resource investment, and also prevents players from getting like 100 kills an hour by being able to camp inside the area indefinitely. It's a way to semi-artificially keep the value of his already valuable common table. Now, to compare it to the skill-focused encounters of today, Vorkath sits on...
That is a controversial thing on whether it's good or not. I think it's okay to have both types of fights, but I'm not a huge fan of chip damage. If I play perfectly, I think I should be able to stay there all day, but the fight should be difficult enough to where I can't do that. Unless I'm just like Wooks or something crazy like a robot. You know, that's why I like Doom a lot.
On what I would call the opposite end of the spectrum. It's not balanced around player execution, but rather the old school preparation with minimal mechanics and maximum RNG. That's not to say there isn't tech here, there is, but by and large, most players aren't getting more than 2 or 3 kills a trip. Over time, this design really started to become frustrating. Players didn't want these random spikes in damage just for the sake of balancing some vague, barely tangible concept of economy, and Jagex responded to that. Over the next couple years, fights began to utilize a different kind of damage calculus, more like Jad from the Fight Caves and less like the Calphite Queen. This is where the on-hit versus on-animation separation really comes to a head. Put simply, damage in old school RuneScape is calculated in two ways. On animation, where in the moment the enemy starts doing an animation, the hit has already effectively been registered, as in you cannot pray against it in a reactive sense.
This is a tough thing for a new player to understand, is when do I pray? Because there's different bosses and you kind of just figure it out by messing it up, or you look it up ahead of time. But it's interesting that they swap back and forth kind of between the two different prayers. Like sometimes you, like Leviathan, you just pray before it. Wait, actually, I don't remember Leviathan if you pray before it leaves his mouth, or if you pray before it hits you. Like Scourgeous is before it hits you. So you can change it midair. And then Jad's like a double, where he'll do an animation, then you pray, and then the projectile leaves. And so you have that window before it leaves, right? And then you have something like Spindle, which if you're doing range on Spindle, it's 8 attacks range, 8 attacks mage, and you have to swap before it leaves. Otherwise, you're taking damage. And so it's like they kind of mix it up.
This is how most damage is handled. On hit is a more intuitive function. The animation starts, the projectile flies toward
Levi
you,
and Manticore are the same, but they're different.
By praying accordingly. It visually makes sense because most games work this way.
Okay.
Vorkath, like the Calphite Queen, isn't driven by reaction times to his auto attacks. Therefore, you can just get unlucky and tank hit after hit after hit. Sometimes a 2 or 3 kill trip could be cut short because of how unlucky you were. On the other hand, on hit encounters such as the Leviathan here, pure reaction time and skill is the governing factor. There is no luck, just execution, which creates a level of consistency that a lot of players found satisfying. But it also creates the issue of not accounting for the very reason why fights like Vorkath work the way they do, to balance the game. Leviathan may be a far better boss on every conceivable front, but it doesn't solve this issue. That's where difficulty, skill checks, start to become the norm. But not before Jagex implemented an alternative half measure, something called chip damage.
Yep, there we go.
You can react to just about everything, you can pray correctly, but upon doing so, you still take damage, just way less than you would have otherwise.
The chip damage
a 40 will
in
turn
CG
into like a 4. Again, a way to integrate consistency into balancing resource input with the encounter's output.
It's
but
rough.
Players too got fed up with taking an endless stream of damage, so even that has been mitigated and turned into mostly skill expression. On one hand, fights today are more exciting, creative, and expressive than ever before. On the other hand, they are balanced only by the ever-increasing skill ceiling of the game. Players are getting better, and due to this, the value of older fights will eventually decrease because they become more farmable. It's an interesting conundrum. I know I prefer the design of fights today, and when Jagex ports an older encounter over like Nex with relatively minimal changes from its original incarnation from 2011, it sucks. It makes for an obnoxious, shitty, annoying, stupid, barely functional encounter that like 12 people in the game enjoy. I don't like Nex, but it does have its merits, even if they are a little esoteric to process and might not be worth it in the end. My absolute favorite part of old school RuneScape's boss design has to be when they integrate evocative RPG mechanics into what are otherwise standard encounters. I think the roots of old school RuneScape's bossing are now firmly understood: prayer, movement, and gear switching, which we didn't even touch on much in this video. Yet there's a lot more to appreciate. I call RuneScape a curated sandbox, a way to point out how intentional its design is, while still also motioning to the fact that it has a dozen different paths like your average sandbox MMO. It's a blend of a traditional MMO with a sandbox one, and its ability to be that is a major reason for why it's so successful. The way all of its different systems cross-pollinate is so cool that I made an entire 50-minute video about it. What's arguably even cooler is that this kind of cross-pollination hyper-integration manages to weasel its way into general boss design too. While games like World of Warcraft have established their combat niche with super tightly tuned boss fights that push the best groups to their absolute limits, Runescape manages to do that on the top end while still finding novel ways to not box itself in mechanically, thematically. Sure, the roots are prayer, movement, and gear switching, but the fights that break the mold just a bit are often some of my favorites because they are only possible in a game like Runescape. An example would be Surok Magus from the Grandmaster quest While Guthix Sleeps. He's a mage of inordinate strength, one you had to deal with in a past quest, but now must take on at his full power. While magic in Runescape has since taken on quite a few different faces and spellbooks, Surok is defiantly a traditional long-bearded evil Gandalf-type mage. Elemental spells, the old-school traditional spellbook, is
Guys,
the name of the
I
game.
also one-shot this guy.
Because the old-school Runescape spellbooks house both combat
in less than 3 tries.
spells, you don't need to choose what you do. As long as you have the runes, you can kind of do it all whenever you want, which allows Jagex to create some novel D&D-esque mechanics for this quest-specific boss, such as him throwing out a magically protected explosive. If you try to pick it up and disarm it, it explodes, dealing massive amounts of damage to you. So clearly handling it with your bare hands is a bad idea. Who would have thought? So instead, use a niche spell in your spellbook called Telekinetic Grab, which can be cast from a distance and places the object directly into your bag. But when you do that, you are faced with a lit explosive in your bag. That's not good.
Bro, I think Shobek just ate through all the damage on this boss. He did no mechanics, and he just out DPS'd it. I don't think he even did the thing.
Good, it'll still explode. If you can't disarm it, surely
you really got Void Waker before D-Pick? Yeah, I did, JPC.
There's another unique spell in the standard spellbook.
Oh,
Alchemize. Through sheer creativity and magical prowess, you telekinetically grab it and then alchemize it while it's in your inventory, transforming it into a couple gold coins for your effort. What an absolutely amazing idea. The solution to this mechanic feels like something the funniest party member in your D&D group would come up with. It's awesome. Genuinely one of the coolest mechanics I have ever seen in a modern MMO. RuneScape is chock full of these game-specific sorts of things, such as the jar mechanic on Zebak, one of the bosses in the 3rd raid. He spits out poison, rocks, and jugs all around the arena, and you only have a handful of seconds to figure out a way to clear out the poison around these rocks, because he's about to let out an ear-piercing roar that will damage you and likely kill you if you don't hide behind the rock first. You can roll these jugs, which are full of water by the way, in any direction, and when you do, you must time a precise shot with your ranged weapon to shatter them, washing away the poison. You can also roll one of them into the rock itself, which also breaks the jug and clears the poison. It's the little things like that which adds so much flavor to a fight that, like many others, is mainly reliant on well-timed prayers and movement. There are so many different examples of novel mechanics in old school RuneScape. What's your favorite? I'm sure there is so much more to say about old school RuneScape's strange evolution.
I like Doomwave 8, 7 and 8 in Doom is really nice. Those are my favorite mechanics in all of the game, because you can do it without taking any damage if you do it perfectly, and you're constantly balancing between like positioning, movement. You have to swap weapons to spec the boss. You have to kill grubs, avoid stuff on the ground, clear the ground. You can like clear the ground with the ball, and then you can also, if you DPS it fast enough, you can actually skip mechanics, which is cool too. So it has like all of the cool stuff in it.
Evolution. What once was a point-and-click game is still a point-and-click game. You're just pointing and clicking a dozen different things every few seconds. You aren't just idling, waiting to see if you need to teleport out because you've been hit back-to-back-to-back 40s by the Calphite Queen. Because today, even the Calphite Queen has highlighted player ingenuity. It's still a horrible fight, but in it being so horrible, creative users have found ways to alleviate the taxing RNG just a little bit. In this video, you've likely seen clips of me doing the Calphite Queen and stepping underneath her in 3-tick increments with a high-speed magic weapon.
Is he using
which allows me
Ayak
to
on the
stall
Calphite Queen?
Queen's 4-tick attacks, effectively hitting her twice for every single
With
attack
an
she does
Infernal
against
Cape?
me. Even the dingiest, oldest, driest caves housing the most outdated and frankly obnoxious boss encounters, the players have found ways to let their creativity sing. Something only made possible by this game's obtuse challenges and grindy gameplay. If everything came quick, then no one would care enough to figure these things out. If everything was immediately palatable and understandable, then that would be true too. Finally, we all
Bro, theory-wise has Virtus, Ancestral, Gauntlets, Ayak, Heart. What the hell? This guy's pumping.
ought to give credit to Jagex too. Lesser studios would see these things as exploits, as game-breaking, as things worth patching out in favor of developer intent. Yet here it all is, as janky and unwelcoming
Surely his
as
GIM
ever,
partner
made
got it?
all the
Is that all RuneScape is? Unless you're just an Iron Man, everyone assumes that somebody else got all the items that you have if you're a GIM. That's crazy.
better by a community still
Probably true, though.
sourcing information from each other. Other MMOs have made themselves so welcoming, frictionless, and short that the community doesn't need to create the world's best game wiki just to share.
He's got two Doom KC? No, theory-wise, no. Let me look this up right now. Theory-wise, Doom KC, where is it? 2? Theory-wise, you better give that Eye of Ayak back, bro. What is going on? You guys were right. He didn't earn it himself. Holy.
Welcoming as ever, made all the better by a community still sourcing information from each other. Other MMOs have made themselves so
those are just
welcoming,
deep delves?
frictionless, and short that the community doesn't need to create.
Some people do get all of their loot without any deep delves. So maybe he did earn it. It happens. It happens.
The world's best game wiki just to share the optimal routes and strategies with other players. Why should players talk if there's nothing to talk about? Why should information spread if it's also immediately solvable?
Wasn't yours wave 3? Yeah, but I have over 30 deep delves. So it's more than 2.
Perfect, but the hurdles that RuneScape placed for its players has seemingly struck the ethereal balance of being annoying in all the best ways. Not to pull back from the topic of this video too much, but if you're ever wondering why every other MMO's content creation space is news coverage and reaction videos, this is why. A game is only as impactful as its demand. That's why people love the obtuse difficulty of Dark Souls games and why Dark Souls fans cannot shut the fuck up about Dark Souls, me included, because the moment you manage to wrangle the intricacies, the depths of its systems, you can't help but talk about them, share that experience.
I never played Dark Souls.
That's all about shared experiences.
But everyone says it's good.
That's the part that always makes me laugh when other people criticize old
I played Elden Ring
for being antisocial. Sure, we don't have the same copy-paste raid every 6 months that pits 20 people against a collection of similarly adapted yet incredibly challenging mechanics. And I do love the raids in World of Warcraft, but what we do have, to me, is more important.
Calphite Queen head, I need that.
Collective, communal understanding.
Nice.
While other MMOs have struggled to retain their communal features because of how frictionless they've become and the fact that people just choose to use Discord to communicate instead, Jagex maybe unintentionally adapted the MMO to a modern space without sacrificing the identity of an MMO. The communal elements exist in areas that otherwise took communality away from MMOs. Theory crafting happens online, on Discord, between two people who eventually scatter the information out across the internet. The entire game is built on top of group experiences, group knowledge, that language I mentioned built over the course of 25 years that is wholly unique to this game. I can say I just got a Ruby proc while Wook's walking, and that actually makes sense to a frightening portion of RuneScape's community.
Yeah, I understood that.
That's kind of special, right? Not to be too corny or saccharine, but what I'm trying to say is, Jagex, rework next.
Why is he talking about Saracnus?
It's really bad. I hate this fucking fight. Why do I need to spend 30 minutes fucking around getting KC only to chug brews the entire time? There are like 6 pieces of endgame content in this game. You can't just keep it like this. It needs to change. People, everyone who's still listening, tell Jagex to rework next. This fight sucks. This fight fucking sucks. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my channel members.
Bro, I was kind of feeling that same way about Spindle. Is Nex worse than Spindle?
For supporting my passion. If you want to become a channel member and get early access to my Fireside podcast, you can do that for only $2 a month. Otherwise, stick around by subscribing, and I'll see you next time.
It's worse? Oh no. I'm not looking forward to Nex now. I like Nex. I heard you need like 20,000 Serapots like per kill in there. It's crazy. That's way too many. They made it Easyscape in 2025. Trio and Duo Nex is good. Oh man. All right. I think I'm like a year away from doing Nex or something like that. We're like a long way. I think we need to get Bando's gear. We still have to do like God Wars and Yama before we get to Nex. So we're a little bit away from that. Good video from Theory-Wise though. It's kind of cool to point out all the things that make the evolution of RuneScape and where it started and how the players broke essentially what Jagex added to the game, and then now it became a core fundamental part of how they design the game going forward. Like how they like tile skipping and one tick prayer flicking and things like that were things that players discovered, and then now they incorporate those things as difficulty when they're designing fights. And I think all that stuff is what makes RuneScape kind of special. But that was kind of true what he said at the end too, how, you know, you could say something very specific and anyone who plays that game would know what you're saying, like Wook's walking. And if you understand, if you know kind of thing. That's what's cool about RuneScape. It's very true and authentic to itself. It has its own language. I like that about RuneScape. I like that I'm not so clueless now as well in comparison to when I started. It starts to feel good once you understand the language. Even though it just took me 20 minutes to figure out how to get to these blood velds while we were watching that video. I finally figured it out though.